Good morning, everyone, and welcome to your morning briefing for Wednesday, 16 April 2025. This is Robert standing in for Mike. Let's get started with Inside the Beltway. So the Trump administration is offering a second deferred resignation for federal employees, and this is the deferred resignation buyout that was offered earlier this year. And according to a person familiar with the situation, 20,000 IRS employees are planning to take this deferred resignation offer. And this is important because that is about 1/5 of the entire agency, and this could hold up tax filing and tax revenues alongside what we reported before, where people seem to be questioning more if they should even file and could end up owing taxes. And this seems to be setting up a shorter timeline for this debt ceiling fight that's imminent, as possibly as early as late May. And then Trump yesterday threatened that Harvard University could lose its tax exempt status if it continues what he called pushing political, ideological, and terrorist inspired / supporting sickness. Tufts University Center for State Policy Analysis said that removing university tax exemptions is a threat to the current financial setup of universities. And now it looks like Trump is putting financial pressure on these universities, as he has done with big law that we've previously reported, in order to get compliance, or at least, I think, mitigate universities' organized resistance to the Trump agenda. And there are no hearings to report on today because Congress is still in recess for the next 2 weeks. Democrats are planning to make a trip to El Salvador over the deportation of Kilmar Abrego Garcia. This includes Senator Chris Van Hollen from Maryland, and he said he's going to travel there today to fight for the release of Garcia. And he announced this at a town hall earlier this week, and where he claimed that Garcia was in the U.S. legally and characterized the Trump administration as an authoritarian regime, quote, picking on the most vulnerable. I also saw Senator Cory Booker is planning to organize a separate trip to El Salvador. And there are a couple of House Democrats that want to go, but in order to get an actual official trip there, they have to get the go-ahead from the House Speaker or House leadership. Maryland District Judge Paula Zennis, who is the judge that's presiding over this case, she said yesterday she's going to order the Trump administration to send officials to testify, and is even considering holding these officials or other Trump officials in contempt of court. And as Mike and I talked about yesterday, Democrats are really leaning into this as the tipping point for their attempt to declare that Trump is causing a constitutional crisis. And they're leaning into claims that Garcia had a legal immigration status, and that I think with the idea to mobilize the Democratic voter base ahead of the midterms, because they're also claiming, and I think with the purpose of riling up Democratic voters and supporters, that Trump could deport U.S. citizens to El Salvador's CCOT prison after he deported Garcia. And I think this is also likely an attempt to mobilize more protests to keep pressure on the Trump administration and rebuild political momentum that the Democrats lost after the 2024 election. Moving on to our roll-up items for today. The Energy Information Administration said in their annual energy outlook yesterday that U.S. shale oil production is going to peak at 14 million barrels per day in 2027 and maintain that until 2030, and then rapidly decline to 11.3 million barrels per day by 2050. I think it's important to point out that peak shale oil production does not mean that we are running out of oil. It just means that it only ever becomes more expensive to drill as some of the easiest shale fields start to dry up. And I think we actually originally reported on this a few years ago, I think in 2023, when there were some major energy and finance figures predicting that we would hit peak shale oil production within the next few years. And then, Jared, if you could come on to cover your roll-up items, please.
Yes. So starting here in my home state, both Ohioan senators, our governor, Mr. Mike DeWine, and Lieutenant Governor Jim Tressel, all sent a letter to Energy Secretary Wright asking for a majority of the allocated funds for uranium enrichment to actually be spent on the American centrifuge plant down in Piketon. They claim that this is the only extant enrichment facility in the United States. And from what I could find, it looks like we shut our other two enrichment we, the U.S., shut down our other two enrichment plants over a decade ago. And this does appear to be the only one. Being that it is the only one, kind of makes it a strategic vulnerability as we switch back toward coal natural gas, and nuclear. There was, moving on to the global roll-up, there was a destabilization plot that Jordan found and removed that I found exceptionally interesting. So there were 16 people in a plot to destabilize the Kingdom of Jordan. All of the, some of the USDs claimed that they were recruited by the Muslim Brotherhood. And these people were all building missiles and drones in a hidden facility that they could conceal. The missiles and drones were concealable.
Yeah, that if I remember right, when I read about that, the Jordanian government said that these were effectively illicit drone and missile factories they had not previously known about, and that makes me think of, what's the possibility we may have illicit drone factories here in the United States, because I think we reported on it a couple of years ago. There was that Chinese illicit biolab found in a California industrial park.
Yeah, that's kind of where my mind was going to, but frankly, I don't have an answer for it right now. Moving over to Asia proper, the U.S. and Korea performed a show of force against the North Koreans and the Chinese with a pair of fighter-escorted B-1B bombers over the peninsula on former North Korean leader Kim Il-sung's birthday. Now, I think this is appropriate to be considered a show of force against both, obviously for North Korea, but for mainland China, most of the B-1's weapons are capable of striking it from Korean airspace. Staying in Korea, the acting South Korean president toured the Hyundai heavy industry shipyards and Kia Corporation's auto plants in preparation for trade negotiations with the U.S. And we've previously covered that Hyundai is offering to assist Huntington Ingalls, our main shipbuilder here in the U.S., in accelerating their shipbuilding capacity. I think that's going to be an official offer from the Korean president. And ahead of Saturday's talks, U.S. Special Envoy Witkoff has called for the total elimination of uranium enrichment in Iran, but Iranian officials are saying this is a non-negotiable position. This is actually a walked-back position from a 3.67% enrichment that was previously agreed upon by Iran. So I think this is going to end up being just a negotiating tactic with some enrichment remaining and then oversight.
All right. Thank you for that, Jared. Let's move on to our warning items for today. And first, in the domestic and some major copper industry companies, including Rio Tinto Group, Trafigura Group, and Southwire Company, made some public comments to the Commerce Department over potential tariffs on key metals, including copper. And they said the Trump administration should impose export controls on copper concentrate and copper scrap rather than tariffs on copper imports. There was another interesting comment from Switzerland-based MKS PAMP SA, their head commodities analyst. And they said that the copper industry suggesting export controls is a reflection of what he said was globalization breakdown and more countries using protectionist policies to secure critical minerals and metals. The argument that from what I understand from these copper producers is that tariffs on copper would push importers to flood the U.S. market, while export curbs would help build domestic copper refining, because it would increase the supply of copper concentrate and copper scrap in the U.S. and lower input prices. But I think with the implication that it would become more profitable for refineries to be built in the United States, or additional refineries, because we do have some refinery capacity that it's just very insignificant compared to Chinese copper refining. But I think export controls, which the Trump administration could implement, though they haven't made a public comment on it, would cut a significant position of copper concentrate and scrap to Chinese refiners. And at the same time, if Trump does impose these tariffs on imports of these refined copper and finished copper products, this would disrupt U.S. supply chains of a key input for power infrastructure, especially as we're seeing the Trump administration and U.S. states trying to ramp up power production to mitigate the projected shortages. And moving on to our next item, a California Democrat kingmaker named Lorena Gonzalez. She runs the California Labor Federation and is a former state assembly member. She's calling for the Democratic Party to break with the tech industry. And she says this is in order to win back blue-collar voters. This is important because Gonzalez runs a major get-out-the-vote operation that she says, and a lot of California Democrats say, helped Democrats flip some House seats in California and almost got them to the point of taking control of the House in 2024. and she has significant influence in the California Democratic faction of the national level party. I think she's likely Gonzalez is likely to pull California Democrats more leftward, including at the national level. And as Mike and I have talked about pretty extensively, opinion polling points to Democratic voter dissatisfaction with this leftward swing of Democratic elected officials, and further leftward movement of the National Democratic Party could hurt Democrats in the midterm. And I think this is important because if Democrats remain locked out of power after 2026, this would likely accelerate their use of what Senator Chris Murphy, who's that Connecticut Democrat, called exceptional tactics to disrupt the Trump administration. So we could see a lot more protests, a lot more actions in Congress to try to trip up the Trump legislative agenda. And one of the big ones I'm looking to in the next couple of months is this fight over the debt ceiling. So if Republicans fail to pass this budget reconciliation bill that I think includes $5 trillion debt ceiling raise, by the time we hit that X date, the Congress is going to have to pass a separate or an individual bill. And I think Democrats are willing to risk a debt ceiling breach in order to resist the Trump administration. And then moving on to our final warning item, Jared, if you could come on and give us the rundown on China and Boeing.
Absolutely. China ordered its airlines to refuse to take delivery of all Boeing aircraft, even if they paid for it, and for their airlines to cut off replacement parts supply chains as well. Now, this is in response to the 145% tariffs that the U.S. has leveled against China, and the government's looking to assist its companies with their losses. Now, this is important because China upon them leveling 125% tariff against the United States, they also announced that they would no longer be matching the United States tariff for tariff. And that the reason they did that is that they said they had effectively priced out the imports from the United States. And it appears that they will simply be cutting off purchases in order to continue the trade war. So as tariffs from the U.S. go up, I think they're going to just start cutting things off here. Now, their top purchases that I think are most likely to be subject to cessation are more aerospace parts, because this was a single company, a big one, but a single company. Navigation equipment, semiconductors, medicines, and industrial machinery, which you can see here are all part of the top 10 jobs supported here in the United States.
Yeah, there's a lot of and I don't think it's incorrect. A lot of analysis saying that the major dynamic between the U.S. and China is that China is dependent on U.S. markets, and that's why these tariffs on Chinese goods would be effective for putting pressure on China. But I think you bring up a really important point, is that there are still some exports that the U.S. exports to China, and now they have, there's been a lot of talk about they're kind of switching tactics on dealing with a trade war. I think we've even talked about it, instead of engaging in tit for tat tariffs, doing things like potentially seizing U.S. firms or foreign firms that are in China, officially taking control of intellectual property and stuff. But I think this is one point where China is being very adaptive in this trade war, and now they're targeting specific industries where the U.S. has a market in China.
Yep.
All right. Thank you for that, Jared. Let's move on to questions and answers. And the first question from Frozen Nomad: how long does it take for low oil prices like we're seeing now to seriously squeeze Russia and thus its ability to continue the Ukraine war at its current pace? Well, I think the floor for Russian oil has been just above that $60 a barrel price that the EU imposed. And yeah, I think Russia has relied a lot on those energy exports to keep its economy going in the face of being kicked off SWIFT and these major sanctions from the U.S. So that could put them in some trouble, and that might move them more towards making a deal with Trump over the Ukraine war.
Maybe. Thank you for that insight.
All right, Bad Wabbit: what's the status of the Brits and EU's proposal to put boots on the ground in Ukraine?
I have not seen anything saying that that's going to come before like a peace deal. Basically, it would all be dependent on peace, and they would just be an enforcement force for that peace. That said, whether or not they can, especially the British military can even support that is a lingering question. I think last I saw, they I'll double check their numbers, but it's not. They can't put a sizable force that would actually make a difference. It would basically just be a sacrificial lamb.
Yeah, I think that I think on the Ukraine thing with a lot of these European countries talking about deployments there was a lot of, I think a lot of it was bluster as far as actually putting a fighting force there, not a peacekeeping force. Because, like you said, the UK, the last I looked, has like 25 functional tanks in the entire British Army. And Germany can't supply all of their infantrymen with rifles, and it's not a very good situation right now for the European powers. And I think they've even acknowledged that. That was you've covered this a lot. Has been this this talk within the EU countries that they need a unified defense production strategy, and that's because they've all recognized over the last year that they just are incapable of producing enough munitions for a peer to near peer or peer to peer conflict.
Absolutely.
All right. Next question, also from Bad Weather. What's the status of TikTok, the recent promotions of manufacturers bypassing IP/wholesale purchasers of goods by selling direct to the consumer? Violates all sorts of laws, and they are promoting that on TikTok. Yeah, that was a very interesting. Apparently goes back to March. Some of these videos are older and have kind of resurfaced. I haven't seen any talk from the Trump administration about doing anything about it. I don't think it's possible, just because these companies probably have the support, I would imagine, have the support of the Chinese government in doing this. And I think it's a very effective kind of psychological operation or information operation strategy. My take on it is that these companies, it serves two purposes. One, it keeps these people purchasing direct from these factories, so they get more direct infusion of cash. And two, I think it's an attempt to undermine or get some of these private industries on board with pushing back against the tariffs.
Regarding specifically the status of TikTok, I think the Trump administration will allow it to remain, especially as these videos are going forward, because in my opinion, I think this is actually a tactical blunder on China. What a lot of these manufacturers are doing are basically saying to luxury brands, we're going to use our overcapacity to drive down your prices, which is an attack on culturally important brands for Europe, and that will help bring Europe back on side for the United States. So it doesn't make sense to me for TikTok to be attacked until it's outlived its usefulness.
Yeah, everything I've seen from the Trump administration, and Trump personally has said that he wants a deal on TikTok. He wants a U.S. purchase. And so I don't think it's going to go away. But I do. We talked about this after the show yesterday on the Chinese manufacturers. And yeah, I agree that it could backfire, because it's effectively telling these European and U.S. firms that at any point these manufacturers could do this anyway. These OEM, or this original equipment manufacturers. That just means they provide, for like Nike, they provide whatever base model shoes, or for like the Hermes or luxury brand, they provide a base model purse or whatever, and that they could do this at any time, and that might actually end up turning these U.S. and European firms away from advocating against these tariffs. Let's see. The next question from Greg Knott. Speaking of oil, why is oil so low but gas is still over $3 a gallon? Well, I think the prices lag. Two, this is very regional dependent. I think in California, for example, gas prices are going to be higher because there have been state level regulations put on refineries and energy companies. I think just anecdotally here, where I'm at, we actually are under $3 a gallon. Not very significantly, but we are under $3 a gallon. So yeah, I think it's a price lag combined with regional issues, where you're going to have some states that have had recently passed stringent laws and regulations on oil refineries and on gasoline refineries.
Yeah. The regional point, I think, is exceptionally important. If you don't know where you stand in relation to the national average, it's hard to gauge where it's going to go. I know here depending on which gas station I go to in my town, it's either a couple cents below the average or a couple cents above the average.
All right, and then from Bad Wabbit, do you know the tariff limit on imports? I know from Canada it's like $700. I'm assuming that means $700, and that if this is referring to the de minimis exceptions, as far as I know, the Trump administration is still intending to eliminate the de minimis tariff loophole. That just means any good that is under $800 in value would normally be exempt from any kind of tariff. But as we have found out over the last couple of years, China has used that, Chinese firms have used that de minimis tariff exception to flood U.S. markets with goods, including fentanyl and fentanyl precursors. All right, let's see if we have any more questions. Well, I think I saw something from Bad Wabbit that wasn't labeled with a question. How many of those illicit biolabs are there? It was earlier in the show when we were talking about the Jordanian situation. That's a good question. How many illicit biolabs are there in the United States? That's not known, and I don't think it's getting in a lot of media coverage. But I would think that there are more than just the one that was found in that industrial park in California last year. And it also, I think there's another video kind of making the social media rounds. The guy's name is I think his name is Tom Waller. He's an energy guy, energy security guy, and he pointed out that in this video in 2019, the Trump administration seized a transformer that was imported from China and said they found a hardware backdoor where the Chinese government or Chinese affiliated hackers could just switch the transformer off. So I think it's pretty clear that there are a lot of areas where enforcement just doesn't exist. Same thing with these railway robberies that we talked about yesterday. There are some areas where there's just not a lot of visibility on what bad actors are doing. And in this case, I would estimate there's at least more than one illicit biolab in the United States.
Yeah, to some degree, we also wouldn't necessarily know how many there would be because that information would be classified either at an LEO level or even maybe in the national security apparatus. So yeah, that is a very hard question to answer.
Yeah, that's a good point. Is that there may be somebody tracking this. It's at least at the federal levels, is how many illicit biolabs are present. I'm sure there is somebody tracking that, but yeah, there's not a lot of publicly available information, and as far as I am concerned, I don't think there's enough questions being asked, especially like mass media coverage. All right, and then finally, I think it's the last question we had for today from Bad Wabbit. I'm sure you guys have heard the chatter regarding an attack on Easter. Are you changing routines or foregoing church due to the chatter or other issues? Personally, I'm not. It's that, but also my church has a security team that I volunteer with in a little bit. So like I'm not personally changing my routine, but I might be a bit more vigilant on Sunday.
Yeah, no change in status here. It's probably the most important service of the year, so got to get going.
All right, well, if that'll do it for today, we'll be back with you at 08 Central. Be safe and stay out front.